afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Global Dialogue. I'm Marwa Siam.
And I'm Theresa. You're joining us here where we research, discuss, and tackle national and international issues through conversations with experts.
This week's actually really important because it falls at the same time as the anniversary of the Arab Spring, which started as a protest in Tunisia and erupted shortly afterwards in neighboring Arab countries. The protests are still ongoing in some areas to this day. Now is the start of the third year after the overthrowing of former Tunisian and Egyptian leaders Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali and Hosni Mubarak. Today we are joined by Walied Khogali, the representative in the Canadian Arab Federation and former president of the University of Toronto Mississauga Students' Union. Walied, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, given that this is a really important time of the year, and especially for the Arab world and the Arab community in the Western world, what can we forecast for that region in the next year or so?
Marwa, I think we can forecast interesting times. It'll be a test for democracy in Egypt and Tunisia. It'll be a struggle for democracy in other parts of the Arab world. In summary, an Arab awakening that will be led by reformers, which are primarily young.
Many commentators and even average citizens have described the Arab world specifically, as becoming very polarized. There's a huge divide being created between political entities and religious ones. Do you feel like this is the case?
I think it's a mixed basket. Let's reflect on the Syrian example. It's a good example of a polarized conflict propagated by support from other powers in the region. It's become a geopolitical battleground for those superpowers in the region that will like to expand their influence in the region. Unfortunately, the average Syrian has been devastated by this war. There's a religious paradigm that cannot be ignored. The rights of religious minorities is at stake in most of the conflicts, unfortunately, whether it's Bahrain, Syria, or Egypt. Political entities will always strive for power. The most organized will garner it. We've seen that in the Egyptian example with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the urban-rural divide playing into politics as well, particularly with Egypt?
Well, the urban-rural divide is an interesting way of analyzing the developments in Egypt. If you look at the data, most of the people that were protesting in Tahrir Square or across Egypt were protesting over bread and butter issues. So it was because of their the economic conditions that they have had. So that's mainly focused in the rural areas, and that's natural with any developing country or most countries in Africa or sub-Saharan Africa, to be more specific. I think an interesting way of maybe analyzing that problem is the role of the Egyptian elite, right? Like it wasn't a secret that the more powerful families or the most wealthier of citizens supported Mubarak, and that's because they wanted to retain the status quo. The revolution was led by those that did not benefit from the regime and wanted to change, especially economic change in the region.
What kind of influence do you think is being exerted into the Arab world from the West, especially from the Arab diaspora living in either Europe or North America? I feel like the elitist and average to sub-average citizen, if I can say, is a tension that's more present in that region as opposed to here. Here, I feel like there's room for influence. What kind of influence have we seen from Arab communities in Canada?
Well, I'd like to caution that we have to be very careful with the level of support the Arab diaspora gives to people in that region. The first thing that I want to say is that if requested, the Arab diaspora in the West can play a role, right? You have to understand that people living in that region are distrustful of the Arab diaspora in the West. So, for example, I know for a fact that the best way Arabs in the West can play a role is to play a constructive role by investing in the economies in that region, or by lobbying their governments in the West to invest in the region. But we shouldn't look at it in sort of an Orientalist sort of perspective where we know better, right, than the people there. I think there needs to be a dialogue between members of the Arab diaspora in the West and the people living in those countries about what they want, not what we think they need.
In terms of current politicians and candidates, I know there are a lot of, especially with the transition that's taking place and that will continue to be taking place in the next few years, what roles are the potential candidates playing, and what roles are they not playing, especially with the current entities in power in certain countries like Egypt and Tunisia?
Yeah, that's a complex question. There are differing views out there, especially if you talk to experts. Let's first note that the political process is not perfect. Democracy is not perfect. I believe that the current politicians will best serve their people by playing a more constructive role, and that's by calling for national reconciliation. And most importantly, I think the role of politicians is to motivate their people to contribute to the development of their own countries. So, politicians can play both roles, either constructive or one that will be catered on differences amongst either the religious communities in those communities, or based on tribalism or whatever ways of finding division. So my hope is that they will play a much more constructive role in the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. So what about now?
I feel like some politicians are using the divisions to their advantage, right? Like there's a power vacuum that was being created, especially in Tunisia and Egypt. Fortunately, for example, in Egypt, that has been filled, and so has been Tunisia through elections, through the democratic process. But we've had some very interesting developments, for example, in Egypt, where the constitution was changed, and you want to have a constitution that's supported by the majority of people. One that protects, for example, religious minorities and the rights of the minorities in general. There have been concerns about the constitution that was ratified, but democracy is not clean, right? Like it's going to take time. I think reformers in the future will move to amend their constitution. I'm glad that there hasn't been any intervention. And it's been left for the people to decide, and that's how it should work. The people should be tasked with improving the political process within their own country.
Going back to that very point, when you mentioned about elections and democracy, what do you make of the allegations that say that the constitutional referendum was tarnished by recorded incidences of electoral rigging, including the barring of potential no voters from gaining access to polling stations?
That's unfortunate, and there have been signs for that, but we let's put things in context. In comparison to other elections in Africa or in the Arab world, what happened in Egypt is pretty democratic. So main observers, electoral observers, have supported the results of the elections, and that is there'll always be some incidents or imperfections in the electoral process, but we had a very record high voter turnout in Egypt, and I think that demonstrates that people are involved in the political process. What happens next, I don't know. I'm assuming that the opposition parties will play a very important integral role in making sure that they keep the current government in check, and we've seen that through the challenges with the judiciary in Egypt. The judiciary in Egypt plays a very important role, and the current president, President Morsi, has tried to limit the role of the judiciary, and you see the reaction from his own people. Constant protests, constant challenges to his interpretation of what the judiciary should do, and I'm optimistic. I think over time, Morsi and his government will have to adapt to a new reality in Egypt, where the young men and women in Tahrir will be playing an integral role in decision making, and in Egypt in general.
So then you're saying that the pillars of democracy are there, or are slowly building within Egypt, but as of now, the Morsi regime is not yet adapting to those pillars and to those standards of democracy and democratic governance, right? Because the judiciary branch and the legislative branch of the government is completely separate, and I'm not discounting the fact that the judiciary has been judicious in ensuring that democracy is in place and fairness abounds. However, in a foreign policy article written last week, The author of this article brought up instances where, for example, new parliamentary electoral laws are skewed in favor of the Islamist dominance of the legislative branch. The example he gave was that under the new law, the Cuyubia Governorate, which is effectively a working-class suburb of Greater Cairo, has been allocated 18 parliamentary seats, while the Brotherhood-dominated Upper Egypt Governorate of Sohag is allocated 30, and the number of votes in Cuyubia exceeds the number in Sohag by 300,000. So, it's certainly not fair yet, but you say you're hopeful?
I'm hopeful because that's nothing new. In the West, we call it gerrymandering. We do the same thing, whether it's in Canada or the United States or any other European country, right? Like people in power, change the rules to favor, their party or their candidates, right? And that could be for positive or negative reasons. Positively, maybe they want better representation regionally or better representational ethnically. And negatively, maybe is to try to stack their legislature, right, with allies. So what's happening in Egypt isn't new. There'll always be a pushback from the opposition, and I think the biggest test will be their next general election. Morsi's been given an opportunity to deliver on the promises that he made during his campaign, and if he does not raise the living standards of his people, he will suffer the consequences the next general election. If you look at his movement towards his foreign policy, it's been, very, very moderate in comparison to what many experts speculated. He's been focusing the resource of his government on, domestic issues, and because he gets it, right? He gets that the revolution that happened earlier was over bread and butter issues, right? So if he does not deliver, he will suffer the consequences. Is the system perfect? Not really. But what I want to communicate is that it's important for us not to look at this development in the Arab world through an Orientalist lens, right? One where we feel, for example, that those countries are not changing, right? The West went through reforms, where the West went through political reform, and there's a time and place when that's happening also in that region. So I'm optimistic in the sense that I see change, and change is happening over time, and the people that, for example, in Tahrir Square continue to organize, right? They've not walked away from the political process. They're re-engaging the political process, and that's the good news.
Mm-hmm. So then, on that point, we mentioned earlier that this has been a student and youth movement. Do you think it's then their responsibility to propel their societies forward? And if not, then whose responsibility is it?
I believe it's a joint responsibility. Any revolution will only succeed with the support of all generations, right? It's not just a constant generational sort of fight. You see a lot of young faces in most of the revolutions in North Africa, and also in the Middle East, and that just demonstrates the vitality of the revolution itself. But the young and the old are affected, right, by the policies of their governments, and what's wonderful is that they are working in concert with each other to bring about political change. It can be best illustrated by the wonderful images that were streaming from Cairo or from Tunis, right, where you see people from all age groups out protesting or out demanding for social justice and better economic conditions for their families. I believe the youth have an important role to play. They've been asked to help lead the calls for reform, and from my correspondence with activists in Egypt and activists in other parts of the world, they take that responsibility seriously, and we will find out the results in the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the factor that leads to stability and growth after revolutions, Anne Applebaum of Slate.com, this was a recent article, she talks about the alternative elite, which is a cadre of people who had worked together in the past, who had thought about government, and who were at some level prepared to take it over. So they are, she says, the most likely people to carry out both radical reforms and to persuade the population to accept them. And so, going back to the example of Egypt, in pre-revolutionary Egypt, many dissenters did exist, but they were largely suppressed, except for the mosque and soccer organizations. But she says that with these two institutions, their numbers were way too big and the emotions they provoked were too strong. And so as a result, the Muslim Brotherhood stepped in, and they were the only political party with, any organizational capacity to carry out reforms after 2011. And Egyptian soccer clubs were then the organization that can be relied on to create major protests. So she argues that an alternative elite is not yet available in Egypt, and that's why things, as of yet, have not improved. So do you think that at this time when these reforms are taking place, that this alternative elite is shaping, and thus it'll take 5-10 years from now for the world to really see change happening in Egypt and thus the Arab world?
Yeah, well, with regards to having an alternative elite, it's a tricky question, because I'm not sure if the Egyptian people want an elite. So I think I'm not an Egyptian, so I really wouldn't be able to best answer it, in that light. But I think they replaced an elite with a hope for much more democratic sort of decision-making sort of process, and more, like having more people involved in decision-making, right? So, to bring about a change in one form of an elite to another, that could be arguable. Naturally, there'll always be an elite group of families or individuals that will benefit from a political process. It just depends on how the system is set up. Egypt is, a social democracy to some extent. They're experimenting with their system. Is that what they want? We should ask the people in Tahrir, but you'll have different opinions, right? Like different people have different ideas of what they want to see from their government, and that's the wonderful thing about democracy, right? Like those conversations will be had over shisha or a cup of tea, and they'll try to map out what they want for their future. But I think you did a great job analyzing the role of the soccer clubs and the Muslim Brotherhood, but there were much more people. There's a vibrant class of people that were involved in the revolution that weren't. Maybe they were soccer fans, but not part of a soccer club, and were not members of the Brotherhood, right? And those are the people that really brought about fundamental change during the final days of the replacement of former President Hosni Mubarak.
As an Egyptian, I think I wanted to just say that, we do have sports enthusiasts, and there are, people who happen to lean towards a religious approach when it comes to day-to-day decision-making. But I feel like the biggest part about being a social democracy, especially in the case of Egypt, is that they want to shatter the concept of an elitist entity. Mm-hmm. They don't want that to exist anymore, because it's existed for so many decades in Egypt that at this point they don't want there to be that sense of superiority or plurality or capitalism. They want that shattered. And I think, like Walied said, because we're in the process of establishing transparency and democracy, this could actually be we could actually be coming closer to that moment where these things don't have to exist anymore, where there doesn't have to be a group of people who micromanage the rest of the society. Mm-hmm. So I think it's like you said, it's a very long and tedious process, but as an Egyptian, I'm pretty hopeful as well. Mm-hmm. So Walied, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for your input. It's been really great and really helpful, and thank you all for listening in. Please tune in next week, where we'll be discussing the humanitarian intervention in Mali.
I'm Theresa Do.
And I'm Marwa Siam.
Thank you for listening to the Global Dialogue.